retirement income review covers three pillars: the age pension, compulsory superannuation and voluntary saving. Brendan Coates from the Grattan Institute joins us now to unpack it all, and I'm glad you're doing that, Brendan, because it's a rather huge document. What should most Australians take away from this review?
Thanks. Look, thanks for having me. It is a very big document, 650 odd pages. I think what most Australians should take away from the review is that, the retirement income system is working pretty well for most people. So you look at retirees today and they have as good a living standard in retirement as what they had while they're working. They're under less financial stress than younger Australians. And so the system as a whole is working pretty well, except if you're a renter. And I think that's something we can talk about. When we look about thinking about what's going to happen to retirees in future, the modelling the review has done, and the modelling is very comprehensive. So these things always depend on the assumptions. And what they have done is they have tested every single assumption and how it might vary if you tweak this number or that number in a way that I think we haven't seen in Australia before. I think that's really worthwhile. What it shows is that the average Australian is on track to have as good, if not probably in most cases, a better living standard in retirement than what they had while they're working. So the benchmark we tend to use, or at least in the review's case they're using, is have you got a post-tax income of 65 to 75% in retirement of what you had while you're working? And on the whole, people are higher than that. So the typical single worker is at 88%, the typical couple is 82%. So they're saving more probably, in fact, than they may well need to sort of be as well off, which is the point of the system.
That's a lot of good news there. Let's dig a bit deeper, because often the devil's in the detail. One of the controversial areas is the legislated rise in the superannuation guarantee. Labor Treasury spokesman Jim Chalmers said the argument that freezing super would boost wage growth, quote, does not stand up to scrutiny, given wages were historically stagnant after the last time this government froze the super guarantee. Is he correct?
Look, no, we don't think so. I think we now have very good evidence from a number of sources, from the Reserve Bank, from Grattan's own research of 80,000 enterprise bargaining agreements over the last 3 decades, research that was commissioned by the review from researchers at ANU. So again, all 3 cases, independent, not linked to the industry at all, have found that when super rises, then wages growth grows more slowly. You think of it this way. In the current environment, firms are not giving very large pay rises. They weren't in the 5 or 6 years leading up to COVID. And the argument that says you're going to get this as an extra amount of money is to say your firm, your employer that was not willing to give you a pay rise, is all of a sudden going to give you the extra, the SG, 0.5% each year, and give you the same pay rise as they were going to give you previously. Now, why would a firm do that? That's the key point here, is the mechanism doesn't guarantee in any way that you get that pay rise. And the evidence is, certainly in our case, every time super's gone up, 80% of it's come at the cost of wages growth within 2 to 3 years. The long-term impact tends to be closer to 100%. That's what the international literature shows. So look, I think this is one where the ALP wants the increase to go ahead and wants to argue that it won't come from wages, but I think the evidence is on the other side of the bargain.
What about another aspect of superannuation? Should the government curb Australia's generous superannuation tax breaks?
Yes, we do think that that is an issue that is being brought back into the public debate by the review. These tax concessions, depending on how you measure them, are something like costing the government something like $30 to $35 billion a year. The majority of the benefits are going to roughly the top 20% of income earners. And there are a reason why the system is less sustainable than it should be. So the cost of those tax concessions is expected to exceed age pension costs by about 2050. It's why the fact that when you increase the compulsory super, you actually don't save the government any money. It actually costs the government money out for about another 40 years. So those tax concessions don't look like they're consistent with the purposes of super, which is to provide income in retirement to supplement or substitute for the age pension, because most of the money is going to those that will never get the age pension at all. And so you should curb them. The most obvious way to do that, the simplest way, would be to cap the amount of money that people can have in a tax-preferred super environment, to stop people getting $5-10 million in their super accounts. But you probably need to go beyond that. You probably need to look at the tax-free status of most super earnings in retirement. It is incredibly generous and probably out of step with the kind of COVID budgetary situation we find ourselves in. So if you were thinking about where do you start to fix the budget situation post-COVID, super tax breaks are probably just about the first thing up against the wall. They don't tend to, cutting those back wouldn't hurt the economy very much. It would save a lot of money, particularly in the long run. And those tax breaks don't look like they are skewed towards high income earners in a way that probably isn't consistent with the purposes of super.
Speaking about that kind of skew, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg says the family home won't be means tested for the age pension assets test. Does this unfairly benefit wealthy retirees?
Look, if you're going to have a means test for the pension, as we do, then it should include all the assets in it. At the moment, we kind of have it the wrong way around. Effectively, the first $200,000 is included in the assets test because you had this difference between the asset-free areas for pensioners who own their own home and those that don't. And that means the person who has a $3 million house in Toorak, the same share of their home's included in the assets test as like my granddad in Bendigo. That doesn't seem particularly fair or equitable. Look, it's a very hard reform to introduce because it would be very politically controversial. But it's probably something that we will need to do in time because the pension, as home values rise, the pension is less well targeted at those that really need it. And, it's increasingly unfair as there is a growing divide between the housing haves and have-nots. Home ownership is falling. So, home ownership amongst older Australians is expected to fall pretty dramatically over the next few decades, because younger generations, people in their 30s and 40s, a growing number don't own their homes at all. And so by about 2050, we expect something like only 2 in 3 older Australians to own their own homes, down from about 80+% today.
So what does the future look like for retirees who rent?
Well, this is, I think, the thing that the review has really exposed, is that if you rent in retirement, you are in deep trouble if you're a pensioner. So the pension is broadly set at the level that stops people from being in poverty in retirement. Rates of financial stress are low amongst pensioners. It's not an extravagant lifestyle by any stretch, but they're getting by reasonably well relative to the rest of the population. But if you're renting, your rates of financial stress and poverty are incredibly high. And it's because rent assistance, the supplement to the pension that is paid alongside the pension to renters, has only risen by inflation for the last 20 years, and rents have risen faster. So it's eroded the value of the payment to the point where, the typical pensioner in a major city, if they're a renter, will struggle to afford housing and have enough left over for the other essentials in life. And this problem's going to get worse. So the review didn't say what should be done, but there's a couple of broad ways you could do it. I think the most obvious way, it needs to be a substantial boost in rent assistance payments. There's very little evidence that will actually be priced into higher rents. It's much more likely to flow through to the individual as higher income that then they can choose to spend on lots of different things. But raising it by 40%, which we think is the bare minimum, would cost you $1.7 billion across all Australians, or about $400 million for older Australians. It's obviously a lot of money, but it's something that we're going to have to do. Otherwise, this problem's going to get a lot worse.
Thanks so much. Brendan Coates from the Grattan Institute.
Thank you.